Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome to this Nedbank Business Banking webinar focusing on the agriculture sector. No doubt the COVID-19 pandemic impact will feature as a key theme throughout the discussion this morning. To all our Nedbank clients, a very special welcome. We value your time and value your relationship. Ladies and gentlemen, we are just over 1,000 subscribers to this webinar today. So to all the visitors, also a very special welcome to you. We trust that you will extract value from this session and that it may be a start of a long and deep relationship with Nedbank. We have two key speakers today, Professor Fadi Meyer and Dr. John Purchase, and I will introduce them shortly. My name is Herman de Kok. I'm Executive Head Sales for Nedbank Business Banking, and I have the privilege to be your host over the next 2 hours. I also want to welcome all my Nedbank colleagues on this webinar. Allow me just to also acknowledge the attendance of senior Nedbank leadership. We have our Nedbank Chairman, Fadi Meyer. We also have our Nedbank Group Managing Executive for Retail and Business Banking, Kiko Thomas. Our Nedbank Business Banking Managing Executive, Gulam Kaida. And then our divisional executives for Client Networks, North and South Division, Dave Schweckman and Craig Evans, respectively. Ladies and gentlemen, this session will continue till 11 o'clock. As I mentioned, we'll be treated by two presentations, and there will be time for questions. If you look at the top left of your screen, there is a link where you can click and then enter your details as well as post your question. This functionality will be available throughout both presentations at any time. So if we are on a particular slide and you do have a specific question on that slide, you can immediately post your question. You do not have to wait till the end. We cannot guarantee that we will be able to address all the questions in the time that is allowed. However, this session is recorded. A recording of the session, together with all the questions and relevant answers, will be circulated to everyone subscribing to this webinar in the next week. You are also welcome to tweet comments and feedback on the following, hashtag NedbankAgric2020, and you will see that hashtag tweet link throughout the presentation. If you're like me and have two teenagers at home, your bandwidth might come under pressure and you might experience a freeze of the broadcast. If that happens, just refresh and the broadcast will resume from there. I would now like to introduce our first speaker. If you allow me to just read his bio. Professor Fadi Meyer grew up on a crop and livestock farm in the northwest in South Africa. He completed his PhD degree in agricultural economics at the University of Pretoria in 2006, following a study abroad program at the University of Missouri, United States. Over his 20-year career at the University of Pretoria, he excelled from a junior lecturer to associate professor. He was one of the founding members of the Bureau for Food and Agricultural Policy, BFAP, in 2004. Through his leadership, BFAP has grown from an informal network of partners in academia, public and private sector to a non-profit company that is internationally recognized as an independent think tank on the African continent, serving the agri-food, fiber and beverage sectors. He was appointed as full-time managing director of BFAP in August 2019 and continues to lead a vast range of national and international strategic projects and initiatives. This includes the agricultural chapter of the National Development Plan for South Africa, strategic sector and investment analysis for a number of private sector firms, and end-to-end value chain projects in a number of Eastern and Southern African countries. He specializes in agricultural market, trade and policy analysis, value chain analytics, strategic foresighting, and scenario planning. To mention just some highlights over Fadi's career, South Africa's Agriculturalist of the Year 2014, President of the Agricultural Economics Association of South Africa 2018 and 2019, More than 135 national and international appearances at conferences as invited speaker. Member of the board, Protein Research Foundation. Member of the board, Agrico Machinery. Member of the board, Regional Network and Agricultural Policy Research Institute. Served on South Africa's National Crop Estimates Committee. Received the Exceptional Young Achievers Award from the University of Pretoria. 13 masters and 11 doctoral students have graduated under his supervision. 9 awards by the Agricultural Economics Association of South Africa, and 64 research reports, working papers, and peer-reviewed articles. Fadi remains involved in the primary agriculture and lives on a farm in the northwest with his wife and 3 boys. He manages the finances, investments, and marketing of the farming business. He is an active member of the community, chaired the governing board of the school, and participates in various fundraising activities. His hobbies include tennis, open water swimming, and performing in the brass band and choir. And on that note, then, I'd like to hand over to Fadi.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Aaron, for this great privilege to present to you this morning on the topic Bending the Curve, and specifically looking at growth. How can we unlock growth, jobs, and transformation in the agriculture and agro-processing sector? The key question that we're currently raising, and that's really in all of our minds, is do we still believe that there's growth beyond COVID-19? And if you listen to the news this morning, one would probably feel a little bit different than a week ago and maybe a month ago, because we've seen that this morning we actually have some positive news, some confidence coming back into the market. The rand is strengthening again. And it seems like investors might be looking at South Africa again as a potential haven for investments. So the question is, how can we really foster growth and job creation? And the key, what I want to look at, is partnerships, focus, prioritization, coordination, and then most importantly, execution of plans. And my colleague, Dr. John Purchase, will also refer to those specific plans, how we can put them together in a new post-COVID environment. So first of all, let's just highlight the impacts that COVID currently has. And there are 3 main areas. The first one is just the virus itself. Currently in South Africa, the impact on the economy from the virus itself, in other words, people becoming sick, is very limited. We've seen in the US, for example, plants closing down, where the physical virus had a significant impact on the agriculture supply chain. In South Africa, that has been minimal. The second category is the panic, which translates into low business and consumer confidence. And there we've already seen an impact in different markets. Value chains are different. Some retails are reporting increased sales, but there are informal markets where the market has just completely plummeted. And some of our industries have been limited to trade at all or do any kind of business during this lockdown period. The third one is then the lockdown regulations itself. So where you, for example, have an industry like wine or tobacco, cigarettes, where sales are limited or prohibited completely, and these industries obviously have much bigger impact than, or have a much more severe impact due to COVID-19 regulations than some of the other agriculture industries that are seen as essential services. I'm not going to go into this complex flow diagram, but if you also look at our website, we posted a number of briefs explaining how complex South Africa's agriculture food system is, the agri-food system. And this was essentially the challenge that government had to go through, and together with industry had to rapidly respond to a number of regulations that prohibited this agriculture food system to operate optimally. And these are small services that are linked either to the input side, to the regulation side, to the exports that, for example, practically certification of exports, fruit exports going out of the country. Is the official seen as an essential service or not? Is he or she in the office? Yes or not? And those are some of the practical implications that we all had to go through. And to a greater deal, most of these shortcomings or challenges were addressed. overall, if we look at the world out there, and these are analyses done by the IMF, if we can have three broad categories, the world, the advanced countries, and the emerging countries. If you can just eyeball that flow diagram, you'll see that the world, the impact of the coronavirus is more severe than the financial crisis that we had in 2008 and 9. So these three graphs explain to us 2008, 2009, and 2020. What are the current projections? So if you look at that screen, you'll see that the dark blue shows the world and a projected decline of the economy, total world economy, of around about 3%. But look at the advanced economies. There, the projected decline is about 6% compared to emerging economies where the decline is about 1.5%. If we go to the right-hand side of the slide, we'll see that South African decline is currently projected at about 6%. Now, these are IMF projections. Some of the local firms are projecting a deeper decline in our GDP of the country. How has agriculture responded globally? And there we see different categories. Countries becoming worried. Export bans, for example, in Vietnam, the third largest rice exporter, they have banned, or there was a certain period where they banned rice exports. And that's important for South Africa because we are importing essentially all our rice from a country, but in this case Thailand. But Vietnam is such a big player, so the moment that they would introduce an export ban, it influences world prices. We had other examples of Russia doing the same on wheat. Canada and Brazil had major shutdowns of their firms, as I just mentioned now, where they had cases of corona infection, where big plants had to be closed down. And for a certain period of time, about 30% of their processing capacity of meat was under threat and not operating optimally. And these are some of the elements that we might expect as South Africa is also entering a potential phase of rapid increases in infection rates. Globally, also on the meat side, if we look at meat trade, it has drastically come down. This is just a map for China or graph. And you can see during this period on the right-hand side, from February, March, there's been a sharp decline in the amount of meat imported into China. These numbers are starting to pick up again as the country is moving out of its restricted period. If we then look overall in a broad-based, what does this mean for South African agriculture and food and the total industry and its prices? Looking at the bar charts, we've got all the green sections are showing prices in rand terms, and these are world prices in rand terms. And we can see from the graph that all those prices are above zero. The price increases are, in other words, in rand terms, all the world prices have increased for South Africa over the COVID period. Whereas in dollar terms, some of these prices, for example, meat prices, have declined in dollar terms. So overall, for all the import or export parity prices that our sector is facing, prices have increased over the COVID period. If we look at responses now, we're moving from the global picture down to the regional, and I want to get to the local in a moment. The African response to COVID, and it's been varying to a large extent depending on how governments treat and their interpretation of the virus. If you look at the bottom, South Africa is definitely has the most strict regulations in terms of lockdown. And if you move all the way up to Tanzania, countries like Kenya, Tanzania is actually green, if you look at that color, with very small and very few limitations currently in the country, whereas compared to South Africa, Kenya is looking for some liftment and regulations that are probably coming in and being introduced this weekend. But overall, there has been flow of trade, and products have been flowing across the borders. Yes, there's been congestion, but trade has continued. The biggest concern is obviously economic activity and the ability of these economies to still be able to afford food. And if you look at the world prices and the depreciation of their own exchange rate, their food affordability is also under severe pressure. Taking this picture then down to the South African agriculture sector and agro-processing, what is our projection going forward for 2020? In the latest BFAP baseline, we are projecting that the South African agriculture GDP will grow actually by 6% this year. And this is good news for the sector. And if we look on the right-hand side, if we do a broad split out of the agriculture sector into agriculture, grains and oilseeds, livestock and horticulture, those three main categories, we can clearly see the distinction. And the bottom line, the blue line explains to you what the increase is in grains and oilseeds. And this is where we see the biggest rise. We have a fantastic summer crop, maize crop around about 15.5 million tons, which is the second largest crop in the South African history. And if you multiply that by the current market price, and remember the exchange rate depreciated, so we have a higher export parity price, the sector is actually in a very good space. The good news is also we have large surpluses. In a year of crisis, in a year where there's severe economic pressure on our low-income households, food security is a very critical element. And it's essentially what this implies is that South Africa's got an abundance of maize meal, which still remains our main staple food. So we can push this amount of maize into our local market and also service our neighboring partners and even go deep sea. So the situation in terms of grains and oilseeds is looking very favorable. If we look at the green bar, that's the one that represents horticulture. And there we have a mixed bag. We have very good international prices due to the weakening of the exchange rate. However, these industries, and some of them are actually in a peak harvesting season now, experience bottlenecks in the ports. So it will all be a matter how effectively can we export the produce out of the country's borders and into the international markets. The sector that's really under pressure is the meat and livestock sector. And there you actually see a decline this year. And the reason for that being mainly because we've had our quick service restaurant industry being closed down for a significant period of time. Those sales were basically in shutdown. The weaker demand of meat. Meat is a luxury product, and we'll have to see what happens actually going forward in terms of the demand patterns. Can the consumer still afford prices of meat? Will prices come down? Our projection is that meat prices will come down in order to absorb some of these economic losses and the ability of consumers to buy and afford meat. I've talked about the summer crop. This is just a bar graph. If you look at that middle section, the total maize, that dark blue bar, that second last one, that is the crop for 2020. And you can compare it to the previous crops of the last 3 years. And even the 2017 record crop. In revenue terms, this crop is the largest that South Africa has ever harvested in its history. If we then look at livestock profitability at Farmgate, I talked about the consumers and their concern, do they have the ability to afford meat, and to what extent will our demand for meat come under pressure? On the supply side, the farmers are actually almost in the same position as last year. If we compare grain prices that are now at export parity to meat prices, this graph illustrates to you that it's almost a sideways movement in 2019 and 2020. So it's not a collapse on the farm level side. Basically, economics at the farm gate moving sideways, and hopefully next year moving upwards as there's more economic growth returning into the market. Just briefly touching then on fruits and nuts. I talked about the challenge to export of produce across the borders into the deep sea markets. And the bar graph on this chart illustrates to you how important the European market is. In other words, the destination of South African fruits and nuts exports currently that we need to get out of our borders and out of our ports. And there you can see Europe still by far the largest share of these fruits and nuts that need to go out of the country, then Asia and the Pacific, then the Middle East, North Africa, and then Africa itself. And if we look at the seasonality of the crop, that's also important to consider. There are some of the commodities, for example, table grapes, where they had their peak in January and February in terms of exports. So in those periods, there were no strict regulations or no lockdown regulations yet. So these industries are literally unaffected to a large extent. There might be some seasonal workers that couldn't move, but overall these industries are not affected. The industries that are currently right in the middle of the heat are citrus, avos, macadamia nuts. There you can see this period, June, July, August, where there's the peak of exports that need to get out of the country. And if you look at the next slide, and this just basically the key message here is we are slightly ahead of exports compared to last year. We're actually expecting a very large citrus crop this year. It's an all-time record crop. Citrus hectares have expanded by almost 20,000 hectares over the last 5 or 6 years, which is good news. There's been major investment in this industry. And currently, despite of all the hardships and all the challenges in the ports, we are exporting, the ships are running, and we are managing to a large extent the exports of these industries. So I want to just summarize what the impact of COVID has obviously brought a significant amount of uncertainty into the market. I've talked about the livestock, the field crops, the horticulture, the different challenges in each industry, but overall, still looking at a positive picture for agriculture. So compared to other industries that are facing major declines, the agriculture sector, if we look at it in broad terms, we are seeing at a growth of about 6% for 2020. I briefly want to touch on the road ahead, and then my colleague Dr. Purchase will talk much more in detail about these processes. Just want to remind the audience of our National Development Plan, the Million Jobs. Those were 3 main categories of growth in the NDP. We identified the underutilized land and the smallholder farmer component that needs intervention, that needs support, where we need to find solutions, critical also for the land reform process. Secondly, our export-led high-value commodities, mainly irrigation. And in the third tier, our agro-processing, the integrated value chains, doing more of this processing and in the local sense of in the country. So there you can see the three the split out, and the different bar charts show you the contribution of each of these growth areas towards the million jobs. And if you look at where we're currently at on the right-hand side of the bar chart, I'll look at agro-processing. There we projected in 2011, we had 228,000 jobs in this industry. Currently, we're sitting at 630,000 jobs. So we've actually added 100,000 jobs in agro-processing. If I look at the middle section, export-led industries, we have added another 25,000 jobs to this industry. The one that's still under stress are the smallholder farmers and the underutilized areas in South Africa. There, actually, if we look at the official Statistics South Africa numbers, the number of households reporting agriculture activity has declined from 1.3 million to 1.2 million households. And this is obviously of major concern to us. I want to jump to the last slide and just briefly talk about the key areas for the NDP and actually the agriculture master plan that's currently, so the NDP is moving towards an agriculture master plan process, and Dr. Purchase will talk about that in more detail. These categories that we have created, we've split out the National Development Plan into more detailed categories. In other words, taking smallholder farmers into consideration, plus your SME agro-processing sector, your large-scale agriculture processing, as well as your large-scale farmers. And currently the focus needs to be on interventions, focused targets that we need to implement for each one of these categories. I want to conclude, and if there are any questions, I would be very happy to answer those.
Thank you, Fadi. Fadi, we have one question coming through, the observation on the bumper crop that we expect on the maize as well as on citrus. What does that mean in terms of opportunities for the agri sector to grow our export base? Does that, if you just look at the global dynamics, open or have the potential to open up new markets for us?
Yeah, Herman, definitely. If we look at, I talked about the expansion of citrus of 20,000 hectares. So that is on top of a 60,000 hectare base that we had. So we've expanded our hectareage of citrus. And if you look at the share in global trade, South Africa's share has increased. So what is actually happening, we are pushing out, or we are gaining traction in the global market, which implies we are competitive and we are growing market space in the export market. So the answer is yes. But if we also look at the amount of hectares that have been planted that still need to come into production, there's a huge pressure on government and industry to open up new markets. So we will actively have to pursue, and I know these processes are currently in place, to open up more markets in terms of bilateral trade agreements, because we know the volume is coming. It's a given fact. The hectares have been planted, and there's much more citrus coming. So yes, we are going to grow our export footprint significantly, and we, compared to other countries in the world, we have to grow our share in the export market. Coming to maize, South Africa is in good climate and good rainfall years. We are always in a very competitive situation. We can produce maize competitively, especially if you look at export patterns into the Asian, Pacific, Middle East markets, and obviously into Africa. In Africa, we have a challenge that some of those countries don't accept GM maize. Kenya, for example, has a very strong non-GM policy. However, sometimes they relax those policies. And we've seen it in Zimbabwe, and potentially we could see it in Kenya again. And our maize could flow into those markets also. So we are projecting a net exportable surplus of 2.8 million tons this year, which is again right up where we used to be with large surpluses in the earlier, about 3, 4, 5 years ago. Then we had these drought years, obviously, where especially the western part of the country was in a severe stress. But the moment that there's a good year, there's good climate, favorable climate, we see tremendous yield increases and a good competitive crop that we can export.
I want to just carry on the question. So good export outlooks. Obviously, there are some key items that we need to get right to be able to really deliver on that potential. But what does that mean in terms of food security in our borders? I think, on two levels. If you look nationally, a good outlook on food security, but what is required to make sure that that gets right through to household and, more importantly, the poorest?
Yeah. Herman, you're asking a critical question, and if you remember that slide that I showed, the 3 growth areas, where we said the underutilized land and the smallholder farming community that's really under pressure, we see that's where the biggest bottleneck lies, and it's actually going in the wrong direction. So then it's definitely a requirement for urgent intervention in this sector, because we can grow all these high-value crops. And yes, to a certain extent, your food security, remember, is also about affordability of food. Do you have a job to buy food? It's not necessarily that you have to produce it yourself. You have to have a job. You need to have the means. So South Africa in the value chain, and it's not the one or the other, it's both. And I think that's a key message that we need to get across. So we need to understand the informal market. We need to understand how to intervene and how to support the smallholder base, where you, for example, have a challenge, there's no collateral, or sometimes there is a collateral, but it's unsure. Lack of infrastructure, support services, extension services. And this is really, I think, we as an agriculture industry and government need to stand together to find those solutions and have an understanding that they are actually playing a unique role in food security. One of the slides that I didn't show in detail that I wanted to talk about, we did a study for the pork industry recently. and where we looked at the amount of informal activities. Now, the pork industry has excelled with their database. They've got fantastic data now. We've also looked at the Statistics South Africa, their database, and we found that the informal herd in South Africa is huge. And if we work it back to job equivalents, it's about 23,000 jobs equivalents at a minimum wage that are created in an informal sector which we don't know anything about.
Good.
And have a huge amount of activity in that sector.
Thank you, Fadi. Johnson Bungu from Solidaridad has a question, and this is more on the sugarcane industry. Any views on the impact of COVID on the sugarcane industry?
Sure. So the sugar industry is also a special industry. It has been in decline, and I think we need to talk about that. Significantly under pressure. We lost about 50,000 hectares of cane due to a number of reasons. There's been urbanization, there's been Aldana, a disease that has pushed down on yields. General economic activity in that sector is under pressure, and we'll need to find alternative solutions. Now, COVID impacts the ones that the sugar industry is not in decline due to COVID. It's been coming a long time. It's a structural problem, and we need to find alternatives for the sugar industry, whether it's in energy, cogeneration, and also looking at alternative commodities that we can grow in those areas. But overall, there are solutions in the industry. There is a master plan already signed for the industry, but these are long-term structural changes and not COVID-related immediate impacts. They can harvest. There might be infections. Again, like I mentioned, the direct impact of infections in plants in the industry itself, but not a major impact as such.
Thank you, Fadi. Thomas Funk from SA Cane Growers. The question reads as follows. BFAP tracks consumer trends. Any highlights during the COVID-19 lockdown on what products consumers favoured? How is the impact on the? How does that impact the agricultural sector?
Now, that's a good question, Thomas. So we have, and we are still waiting for data. So we've seen the first wave of data coming through, but only on prices, not on volume. So we are running the value chain tracker, which is an initiative that we're doing together with the agriculture industry and government to track impacts of COVID on a weekly basis. And there, if you ask the sectors, the food processors, they're all around about 80 to 90% of production levels and sales. So there's definitely an impact on volumes. But as I've mentioned, meats are down much more than vegetables, where you actually see volumes are quite good. And your basic staples are doing very good. There's a big demand for your dry products. The limit where we've seen some limited sales, Thomas, is on the meat side. But vegetables still early days, and on the sugar products also early days. We don't have accurate numbers yet. We will still unpack those as data starts coming in.
Switching to the sheep and wool industry, Mr. Kutsia from Elderberry Investments. Question reads, what would you suggest would happen if in the sheep industry and the price structure for farmers?
Can you maybe repeat this? What would happen in terms of the...
in the sheep industry, as well as the price structure for farmers?
Yeah, due to COVID.
Yeah.
So sheep is very interesting. Again, there are so many dynamics playing out currently, and it's difficult to keep them apart. So the first of all, the sheep industry, sheep and wool, is entering this COVID period with a drastically smaller herd size due to the drought. So the flock numbers have come down significantly. If you talk to Karoo farmers that have been affected by a drought over the last 5 or 6 years already, it's been coming, and these flock numbers are down by 40-50% in some of the severely affected areas. So what we're actually seeing is a limited supply into the market. So sheep meat prices have not fallen that much because, yes, it is your highest end consumer that's buying, and your supply side is also limited. So you almost have your demand and supply balancing out in this current COVID period. And obviously, I didn't mention specifically the success in wool. We had a limited period where wool exports could not go out of the country, which caused a major issue, especially also where the wool growers are one of the industries that have the biggest success in getting smallholder farmers into highly competitive export value chains. So there we have informal farmers, smallholder farmers becoming commercial and exporting wool into competitive markets into China. Those markets have opened up again, and I think it's all hands on deck now to make sure that we get the wool exports going. But overall, the sheep industry is under pressure due to major droughts that have come over a longer period of time.
Lou van Reenen from Beefmaster. The question is, I think, looking into 2021, and with the context or expectation that it will still be a depressed economy, what are the three main parameters to use in financial planning looking at 2021?
Yeah, so Lou, a good question. Again, the basics of we need to keep a close eye on our consumers, carefully assessing to what extent will there be a change in pattern of consumption, and will the consumers be able to rebound? That's for the domestic market. For the international market, understanding our footprint in terms of beef, we've done exceptionally well in terms of exports, entering export markets. When we started off 10 years ago, we were a net importer of beef. We've become a net exporter. But if you look at the trends, there's actually been flattening out. And due to a number of reasons, in other words, and specifically related to biosafety and security in the sector, with foot and mouth, for example, becoming a problem. So I know the industry is working actively with government to solve those issues, because if we cannot grow exports, we are only dependent on our local market. And then 2021 becomes a situation of how do you plan for a local market economy that currently are the projections from the IMF and local institutes are projecting a growth of around about 1.5% to 2% GDP. We're still not back to where we were pre-COVID. So the indications are that your higher end and middle income meat demand will be under pressure next year. The question is, how can you produce at lower costs that beef? In other words, are prices going to come down? Do you keep the throughput and your utilization of your facility, of your feedlots? And then it becomes a ratio between your beef and your weaner prices. At what price are those weaners going to come into the market? And then just lastly, there are so many factors currently playing a role. Are you going to build your herd or not? Because we still have to remember we were actually, before COVID, starting to enter a herd building phase.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for all the questions coming through. We really appreciate it. We still have time for some more questions for Fadi. I know we're working against the time clock. Fadi needs to go into another appointment in a couple of minutes, but we have time for a couple of more questions. Just to our Nedbank staff, thank you also for your questions, but I'm going to give preference to our clients on their questions. I'm going to make one exception for our chairman, Vasi Naidu. And the question, Fadi and John, I know you can elaborate on it also further, is more in the context of, we know that you from BFAP and John from ACBIS are doing quite a lot in engaging with government, providing insights to government on the impact of COVID and advising in terms of that. Can you maybe just elaborate on those talks and, through that also the growth projections and impact in the different subsectors that you are sharing with government?
Sure. So I think, first of all, just on a tangible, what are the day-to-day activities, or let's say the week-to-week activities, is what we're running is called a value chain tracker. And it's a survey that goes out. It's a web-based survey that goes out every week, where industry leaders and CEOs of companies across the value chain, or from the input side all the way to retail, are reporting on bottlenecks, disruptions in the supply chain. What are the issues? Is it a regulatory issue? Is it a sales issue that just because of volumes of sales and weaker economy? Or what can be done to mitigate or manage these disruptions? So we've launched that program right in the start, end of March, when we entered this lockdown period. And this has been a constant back and forth between industry, government, and we ran the survey And you could see responses also from the Joint Command Center where they realized I showed this complex food system. And I think there's much more appreciation now for how complex this food system is. And everybody's got to play a role. And if it's a small role, but it plays such an important part in the efficiency of food supplies. So I think that's a first short-term immediate issue that we've dealt with. We haven't been involved in the way that the relief funds will be disseminated or are currently being disseminated. And that's something that needs to be debated. To what extent and where are those relief funds going? Because, as I've illustrated now on the graphs, a lot of these sectors are actually doing well. And the question would be, where can we actually allocate those funds into sectors that really need it? Is it due to COVID, or are there actually longer-term strategic elements that have been coming for a very long time that we just need to address? So all in all, what we're trying to distill is prioritized activities that really need to go. We need to go and do those urgently to gain. And talking about those sectors now, the smallholders, the transfer of land, idle land that's currently not in production. Do we understand how do we bring that land into production? And that's not a COVID-related issue. It's actually a longer-standing issue. And COVID is just bringing to the top, actually, the importance that we have a very competitive food system. But not everybody's participating in this food system. And I think this public-private partnerships, the one thing that we've seen over the last few years is what works and what does not work. And we need to go and focus on the things that do work.
Yeah. Fadi, John Flanagan from Kwanalu has a mouthful of a question. I'm going to read it for you. If growth could be summarized as local money moving within the local economy, we know that exports are money into the economy. But would there be value in an import substitution type focus? And what commodities could be candidates for this?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. Absolutely, it's a spot on. There's definitely opportunity for import replacement. The best success case, obviously, soybeans. We've grown from a production of about 300,000 tons 6-7 years ago. We're currently sitting at 1.3 million tons of soybean production. And the purpose of that was in 2012-13, there was this big drive in combination with IDC, DTI, industry, and a number of players to build local crushing capacity. And it was very obvious what the move needs to be. We are a major chicken producer, major chicken consumer, and we were importing all our soybean cake from Argentina and Brazil at about 1 million tons a year. But we are producing local soybeans, and we have the climate to do it. Not as favorable as Argentina and Brazil, but certainly good enough to produce sufficient soybeans for local consumption and the cake market. So what happened is there was this crushing facilities were built. We have about 2 million tons of crushing facility now, which is sufficient to meet the local demand for soybean cake. And the production is just moving right into that space. So what's happening is you have your oil, vegetable oils, also a product that we are importing, so we can replace that. So those prices are all at import parity. And your base, your soybean, is at export parity. So you had these initial very positive margins, and investment came into the sector, and we actually are doing import replacement. So look at the graphs now, and you see we are importing about 300,000 tons of cake. We're used to import 1 million tons of cake. That's one success story. The poultry industry has a huge amount of imports of broiler meat. And we are actively working with the industry. There are a number of studies already done. They also have a master plan already signed. And in this master plan, import replacement is part of the picture. But we need to be careful in what can be competitively replaced. Where are we competitive? And sometimes the way that you cut up your chicken, you can actually export some of the products, like white breast meat is in big demand for Europe. and drumsticks are a big demand on this side. So it all depends on how you cut up the chicken pieces and the nature of your demand. And what we refer to in this process is called deep dive value chain analysis. And this is what BFAP is bringing now into this master plan process. What we're actively working with together with industry is to really unpack the value chains node by node. So we need to understand at each node in the value chain, what are the critical levers that we need to pull to unlock growth. Those are typical your import replacement, export drive type of initiatives.
Fadi, we have John Durr from Western Cape Livestock Agency. This question is very much in the context of we know that restaurants still cannot receive sit-down clients. And the question reads as follows. Will we see a change in consumer behavior regarding their buying and preparing of meat products? Seeing that a lot of them now for the first time are not eating in restaurants near their workplace, but as they are working from home. What's your view on that?
Yeah, John, I've been, every shop that I enter, every retail store that I enter, I ask that question. I say, are your sales up? And wherever I've bought, and this is obviously not a representative sample, is the volumes are up on home-cooked meals. In other words, there's definitely a shift in buying of food that you prepare at home. To weigh those out, and this is the way that we've put together this baseline, we've made certain assumptions around it, saying we know, for example, chickens and the restaurant and chicken side, the QSRs and the restaurants, about 19% of the market. That's big, and that was essentially closed down. Now the fast foods are starting to move again. But related to John's question on the higher end meat markets, they are still under pressure due to restaurants, the hospitality industry not operating. We are not sure yet whether all the home-cooked meals will make up for the volumes that are lost in the restaurant and the hotel and the hospitality industry. So it's this trade-off. It's the question of the price that you're selling it into the retail side, where the volumes seem to be increasing, versus the hospitality industry. So no clear indication yet. I think there are some industry specialists that have that see these different outlets actively, and they understand it much better. And we'll see when the data comes out again. So currently, probably we are on the red meat side, not quite managing to make up all of that space, but some mitigation is taking place with higher sales for home-cooked meals.
Fadi, KB Mona from Sinar Movar Enterprises has a question on the plans to develop smallholder farmers. And I know most probably in John's session that will also be a question, but I'd like to get your view on that as well. And I think that the question is from the point of concern that if we go into rural, is the emphasis too much on large farmers? Really, does the small farmer get the opportunity to and focus to develop and grow?
Yeah, Herman, first of all, we don't understand enough on smallholder and the informal sector and how those markets work. Into which sectors do they deliver? So we've been privileged to be part of to be called in to monitor or to evaluate a lot of the Jobs Fund programs. So I can talk on those, the experience that we have there. And it's really a humbling experience, and it's fantastic to see some these success cases actually happening where you leverage, you have basically Jobs Fund money, so public money being a catalyst for economic activity, because that's the biggest challenge, is you get private sector in, but on private sector principles, that return on funding and investment, everybody has shareholding, and you need to show confidence, and there's risk involved. So how can you find a catalyst to really get access to credit, get the focused services and support into these smallholder farmers? And then also what's critical to it, don't only focus on the production, because in all of these farmers, we were tracking where their surplus produce goes, and more than 50% goes into the informal market. They're delivering into silos sometimes. They're delivering into informal hawkers, street vendors, just like all the commercial farmers are doing. And in some cases, those markets are operating at much higher prices. Yes, their input side is more expensive, but their output side is also getting higher prices. So overall, we need to understand those models and start to invest and provide support. And I think we need to be clear that which level of support do these smallholders need. And it's different than what a commercial farmer needs. So I would argue, given our food system and the nature, we've got an urbanization in South Africa. We've got the biggest concentration, in other words, number of people, of poor households in cities, not in rural areas. But the poverty is severe in rural areas. So how can your commercial, highly competitive value chains offer food at the most affordable price into cities? But how can also the smallholders and the informal sectors make a huge contribution to the rural areas and the rural economies? And that's where the investment needs to go in, whether it's infrastructure, access to credit, insurance, those type of instruments.
And I think key to that is the collaborative approach.
Yes.
I see a question here from Henk, and unfortunately we won't have time to go into the detail. Henk Achenbach from the Co-op Humansdorp, but the question is very much, and to Nedbank, but to banks, the potential of collaborating with other players in the agri industry. One of the vehicles might be through joint ventures to really get together, get funding together to uplift communities and particularly focus on the small farm and develop them. And there's been good progress on programs like that. If I just look at the blended funding model that we are working on through BASA, is a very good, I think, a very good initiative and vehicle.
Yeah, exactly. Henk and his company, they are doing fantastic work in the Eastern Cape where they're achieving those goals. And those are the type of success stories. We just need to expand them rapidly and bring people on board and channel and coordinate. I don't believe that there's really a lack of funding if one coordinates what is available and the goodwill that there is. I think we can have a huge success if we can coordinate it and target it well.
Fadi, we know you need to go to another appointment. We thank you for your time. Just whilst you're still here, and John is going to join us shortly, just from Nedbank's side, really a privilege for Nedbank to have a strong, long relationship with BFAP and a close relationship, same with AgBiz. If I look at Nedbank and our approach, even before lockdown, before it started, being very proactive, reaching out to our entire client base to see how we can help with any pressures, whether it's funding or transactional means. What was really valuable for us is the constant feedback from BFAP and from AgBiz on what's happening, the deliberations you have with government, the information that you channeled through to us, which enabled us to keep our clients abreast of what's happening. So really appreciate the cooperation, the work and the collaboration and your time today. Thank you, Fadi.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to switch to our next presenter. Just again for the webinar subscribers that joined maybe a bit late, just want to point out again that we have to the top left of your screen a link where you can click on and you can enter your details there as well as your questions. That functionality is available throughout the presentation. So at any point in time, if you have a question, you're more than welcome to provide your question and we will then address the questions at the end. Again, we might not have time to address all the questions. However, this session is recorded, so the recording together with all the questions and the relevant answers, even the ones we did not get to in this session, will be circulated in the next week or so to everyone that attended this webinar at your own time then to go through and to read through. It's now my privilege to introduce Dr. John Purchase, and if you allow me just to read his resume. John Purchase has been the CEO of Agricultural Business Chamber, in short AgBiz, of South Africa since 2007. Previously, he was the CEO of Grain South Africa, Dr. Purchase commenced his professional career as a scientist in South Africa's Agricultural Research Council, the ARC, serving in various research and senior managerial positions for 22 years. Dr. Purchase has also served on the boards of the Land and Agricultural Bank of South Africa and the National Agricultural Market Council. With distinction, Dr. Purchase currently serves as a trustee and deputy chairman of the Maize Trust and also serves as chairman of the board of the South African Grain Information Services. He is the business convener in the Trade and Industry Chamber of Nedbank and is deputy chairman of the Economic Policy Committee of Business Unity South Africa, BUSA, as well as serves as a director of BUSA. In terms of the current COVID-19 crisis, he currently leads the economic work stream within the COVID-19 response task team of the Minister of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, Minister Toko Didiza, to ensure food security for all South Africans. Amongst other awards, he received the 2011 Alumnus of the Year Award from the University of the Free State, as well as the 2012 South African Agriculturalist of the Year Award. In June 2013, he was elected to the board of the International Food and Agribusiness Management Association and still serves in this capacity. In 2019, he was honored by this institution and made a fellow. In December 2018, Dr. Purchase was honored by the French government and given the title of Knight of the Order of Agricultural Merit. This was bestowed on him by the French ambassador to South Africa for his services to agriculture and agribusiness. It's then a privilege for me to hand over to Dr. John Purchase. John.
Thank you very much, Herman, for the introduction, and good morning to everybody. And first of all, a word of appreciation and thanks to Nedbank for the opportunity to address you and to give you our perspectives on some observations and learnings from the COVID-19 pandemic, how it's impacted on agriculture, and very importantly, the way forward. I think my colleague, Dr. Fadi Meyer, provided a very good presentation, and there will be some overlap, but that is perhaps good. So that you get the big picture and you can see how we analyze the situation. Right, so first of all, just the outline of the presentation today. We're going to look at the global impact and developments, because we have to look at the total context within which we are working. Then we'll look at some of the domestic impacts and developments. And then very important, and that came up very strongly in some of the questions already, is the government engagement. That has been very important, and I can outline that for you. Then we'll discuss the way forward for South African agriculture, what we are doing both from the industry side and then also together with government. And then just a short take-home message for you. So I've divided it into those sectors. If we look at global agriculture, there have been major disruptions, obviously, in the supply and demand value chains, bigger surpluses in some areas and shortages in some areas. Obviously, distribution networks have often been disrupted very significantly, even in South Africa specifically. I think the demand side has been the biggest disruption, again, globally and in South Africa, and our changing consumer patterns. In other words, how consumers are spending their money. That has also come up already. We've seen protectionist policies. The Vietnam issue was, and Cambodia issues were mentioned on export bans on rice, and even Russia for a while on wheat. We've seen logistical challenges in many countries, also including in South Africa. Just for example, reefer container availability, equipment issues in SA ports, and also labor challenges in the logistical area. We've seen quite a lot of food waste in especially Europe and first world countries. We've seen labor shortages in Europe because labor couldn't move across boundaries to sell their labor in the agricultural process, again, mostly in Europe. And then we've seen workplace closures and disruptions in agro-processing, especially, and the meat packers in the USA are a very good example, which you would have followed on CNN, etc. The one good thing on a global space is that your staple foods are in good supply, whether it's maize, rice, or wheat. We basically have surplus stocks in the world, and so the availability is generally pretty good. Also for those that we import like rice, and we import half of our wheat consumption, roughly 2 million tons. So that those stocks are available and we do have access. So that's one positive from a global point of view. What we have seen, though, is huge disruptions in supply chains, and the question has been asked in a leading global conversation piece, a magazine called The Conversation, where it was discussed whether coronavirus has killed globalization. And we don't necessarily think so, but it has certainly caused a shake-up of some very significant proportions, and exactly how we're going to get on from the other side is not too sure. So we do see some reset in terms of globalization. I think the disruption has been tremendous in certain areas, perhaps not so much in agro-food systems, but in electronic equipment, etc., and in motor vehicles, etc., it is very significant. So what we are seeing, and it was a call actually by our government before COVID, and I think COVID is generally going to stimulate this both globally and locally. We've seen in America the same sort of principle being applied even in Europe, is the issue of localization. We are probably going to see more and more protectionist policies coming in and greater localization, and that also goes to import substitution, etc., question that was raised earlier. So critically, localization is going to become a bigger issue, a bigger discussion point going forward. If we look at South African agriculture, I think we can clearly say that our agriculture has not been as hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic as many other industries and even global agriculture. Yes, we must admit that our South African agriculture was in trouble over the past 2 years. It was constrained both from an investment and a confidence point of view, primarily due to severe droughts. 4 of the 5 previous years we had severe droughts both in the summer rainfall areas and in the Western Cape. And then also we've been hit by a number of diseases, and then also policy uncertainty, especially issues like expropriation without compensation, have negatively impacted on the investment environment. So a combination of factors have put us on the back foot before COVID. However, we did, in December already, we were predicting that South African agriculture, primary agriculture now, would grow by roughly 10% year on year, but that would obviously be off a low base because of the good summer crops that we are now experiencing, and then also the good fruit crops that are coming off. Table grapes had a very good season. This season is finished, but citrus is looking very good, and your plum fruits, etc., have also done pretty well. So if we look broadly, it's looking up for agriculture from a primary agriculture point of view. Different story in the processing, and then also at retail, the disruptions in the sales of certain products is also still a big risk. So we did battle with the initial measures that were announced. So your non-food products and services, especially in your wine industry, your tobacco, your moe, your wool, etc., did cause a lot of problems. And we did immediately get certain regulations published around the harvesting of these crops, so that they were not impacted. And our intervention there certainly helped a lot. And then we also had to get them into the export mode. While other agricultural products could be exported, they could not. So we still have the one outstanding issue from our point of view is tobacco, and we certainly want, from an agricultural point of view and the value chain point of view, want to get that open as soon as possible, especially the sales. We believe that it should be opened as soon as possible. Exports have generally been allowed, but what happened is that the port capacity was constrained by the measures to roughly 30-35%, and that immediately caused a huge bottleneck in the harbours, and a clogging up of essential and non-essential goods in the harbours because they were not operating at full capacity or at near full capacity. So this really caused a major problem, and we had to intervene. And government did listen, and we could open up the ports extensively. but we still have major constraints in the ports. Probably it is our biggest or second biggest constraint, depending on how you want to look at it. I'll come to the other big constraint as well. So we are working on the ports. Cape Town is only working at roughly 35% at the moment due to COVID cases. And then also Durban is working probably at 60-70%. We are just managing. We are just coping. If we have any further disruptions, we have problems. It's partly a labour issue, partly equipment, partly management, and we do have a meeting tomorrow with Minister Pravin Gordhan to raise the awareness of the issue, to also propose certain interventions that are necessary to make the ports more functional. Right, then I think Fadi alluded it to, but the biggest issue at the moment is the demand side. And this is where the biggest disruption has been, and this is where we want to advise you to really watch the markets, to see what is happening in the market. So both our global demand for exports looks pretty good at the moment still, especially from the citrus point of view. Vitamin C is so necessary for building up your immune system. So we see good demand from Europe, but also exports to China are increasing. We're still in the beginning of the export season with citrus, but that's looking good. Generally, the demand for our products is looking pretty good, but we've got to work harder to get this right. And we really have need a collaboration effort with government, DTI, DALRAD, the old DAF, DIRCA, etc., to make sure that we access these markets, and I will get back to that. The other one is the local demand. We've seen a decline in local demand. Fadi alluded to the 80-90% of general demand, and certain products more so, especially your products that go through your QSRs, your protein products and your perishable products, also some vegetables like potatoes and lettuce, etc. So it depends on what product goes out through your restaurants and your QSRs and your drive-thrus and your hot meals also in your retail stores. So at least that part that has been partly opened, and that should stimulate demand and create access to food, both economic and physical access to the more indigenous communities, the poorer communities that we have in South Africa, which is actually where the biggest disruption was. So I'll get back to that point a bit just now. I want to go back to the global situation of our exports. Obviously, we are competitive with probably close to 70% of our value chains. We were net importer of agricultural products in 2007, and we were declining. Our competitiveness was declining. We were starting to import more than what we were exporting. So we've managed to turn this around from industry from 2007, and you can clearly see in the green line how our positive trade balance has grown. So we're exporting roughly $10 billion US. The y-axis is in US dollars, not in rand, so there's not a rand depreciation factor in there. So you can see our exports have grown well on the back of fruit exports, wool exports, meat exports that we started with around 2014, and the trend line is in the right direction. So we're earning more dollars, yen, euros, etc., and this has been really good for agriculture. So we have a net trade surplus in agriculture, agro-processing of roughly $4 billion US. And we can expand on that. So where is all this produce going? So up until 2009, Europe was our preferred destination. But with the supermarket phenomenon and our retail stores going into Africa, they took a lot of product from South Africa, both primary and secondary especially. And Africa became our biggest export market, especially the SADC countries. Nearly 50% of our exports going into the SADC region. So very important, but it has flattened off. So we need to diversify and look at other markets. So the Europe market is picking up a bit more, probably on the back of the EPA agreement and better relations that we have with Europe. And then you'll see the strong growth is obviously Asia, and that includes the Middle East and China. Too slower growth in the USA, etc. I happened to have a meeting with a new USA ambassador yesterday, and we're looking to also grow our export markets into the USA in the process. So there's a lot of work that we have to do on the demand side to grow our markets, both locally and globally. Just to show you the risk in terms of Africa, if we're exporting 50%, $5 billion US worth of agricultural products into Africa, you will see that the per capita growth in Africa is going to take a massive decline, and that's your spend on food is going to come under pressure. So we need to understand how the market dynamics are going to change and how we're going to adapt to these market dynamics in COVID and post-COVID especially time. So there have been some additional impacts that we have to look at on agriculture and the agri-food system. I think very importantly is that the South African Reserve Bank cut interest rates by a cumulative 275 basis points. Just on a 12-month basis, that would move to a 4 billion rand interest saving for farmers alone, obviously also then to agribusinesses and other processors and value chain players that are leveraged. So that relief is certainly welcome and will stimulate business in the different value chains. The DELRAD also ring-fenced 1.2 billion to household food security, to small-scale farmers. Not a massive contribution in terms of national food security, but certainly for household food security and poorer farmers. And roughly 15,000 small-scale farmers will benefit from that. Then also the impacts of the downgrade on the sub-investment grain on SA agriculture. There will be transmission effects, lower business confidence, etc., and volatility in your domestic currency, and we've seen that volatility. The Land Bank default, obviously a major concern. Land Bank holds nearly 30% of South Africa's agricultural farm debt, and that total farm debt is roughly 2 billion rand. So it's and Land Bank's contribution just over 50 billion of that. So if Land Bank were to fold, if I can put it that way, it would have a huge systemic risk for the whole agricultural sector. And we have been in talks with National Treasury and with the Land Bank itself to have it recapitalized to the point of being operational, but that will also go with restructuring. So the liquidity crunch in agriculture is a concern to us already now, but then also post-COVID. I think capital will be more scarce. I think the financing by commercial banks, and perhaps everyone can also comment on that just now, is how does the bank see the liquidity crunch that we see basically in the whole economy and then also in agriculture. We do welcome the 200 billion guarantee scheme that has been extended to the commercial banks, and we can touch on that a little bit later. Okay, then I want to touch on government engagement. This has been very important. So there have been a couple of places we have been involved with government. Firstly, through the task team that Minister Didiza set up. I was asked to head up the economic work stream, and we employed, and they did a pro bono for us, BFAP on the value chain tracker reports, 9 of those reports. Every 48 hours we had a report on the desk of both Minister Patel and Minister Didiza in terms of what's happening in the agri-food system. We did various submissions with all the role players in agriculture, and we are still continuing looking at scenarios that may still unfold, because we still don't know what the total impact is going to be. If we're still going to only see the peak around August, September, as the epidemiologists predict, there are still going to be further impacts. And we need to understand what those impacts will be and monitor possible scenarios. So there was a social impact work stream and a communications work stream. Then through Business for South Africa, and that is an amalgamation basically of BUSA, Business Unity South Africa, Black Business Council, and the Public-Private Growth Initiative. And this has been fantastic collaboration through 4 work streams. We worked in the economic work stream, looking at the essential goods and services, the supply chain, security, infrastructure and logistics, and then also building on a master plan from our side, from the business side point of view, and that process is still ongoing at the moment. So just to get to the next point is the small and medium-sized enterprise development project with the Office of the Premier of Gauteng. I just want to say that one of the probably the biggest problem that we've had is the informal market sector that has been disrupted in South Africa. Roughly 40% of the whole distribution and sales of food in South Africa locally is done through the informal sector. And this has been totally underestimated, even to a large degree by us. And I can just mention some figures. 60% of all bread goes into the market through the informal sector. Roughly 30% of the broiler industry, poultry, goes through live fowls. Roughly 40% of fresh produce through the fresh produce markets, bokkie traders, etc., goes through the informal market. And when we introduced the measures, we cut off the legs of this distribution and sales network. And so we have to look at measures to intervene to get this going again. So one of the projects that we are running is with the Office of the Premier, where we are establishing a new project, and because we're now sitting with surplus supplies of certain perishables, especially in your proteins, as was mentioned by Fadi, your meat, your chicken, also potatoes, certain vegetables. We are looking at mechanisms now to use this not just as food aid, but rather as small business development opportunities. And the Premier, I did a presentation to him last Friday, and he has given the go-ahead for this project. We must understand, if you look at the components of food security, we need to see that the one area that we cut off the legs was in food access and affordability. And this created a problem because the indigenous communities did not have the access to the food that we wanted them to have. And the bokkie traders at one stage were stopped. The vendors were taken off the street corners. But that is actually a very efficient system and creates opportunity for small business development. So the next one was the bilateral issues that we had with certain government ministers and officials, also on a one-by-one basis, looking at what are the areas of problems that we have and how to address these. So we've made many recommendations to government in the process. The next one is the way forward for South Africa agriculture. And this comes to the issue of looking at master plan that we are busy with. So let's just first take it, where do we come from? If we look at the pre-COVID situation, I think we must acknowledge that the Zuma administration situation was pretty much a disaster for South Africa. We dropped our per capita income, GDP income, per capita GDP income from roughly $8,000 US to $5,200 US. So we all became roughly 25% poorer in South Africa in dollar terms, which should be the benchmark. And obviously, who gets hit the hardest? The poor. And so household food security has come under huge pressure in South Africa. While we have national food security, household food security is a huge uncertainty and a huge risk for us. Agriculture has held up very remarkably well in these past 10 years, despite the droughts, the disease outbreaks, and the policy uncertainty. We did start with a PPGI initiative in 2018, which we were very much part of. Self did a presentation to President Ramaphosa. He asked for a 5-year plan and also public-private partnership, and we committed to that. And this is the master plan process is now an outflow of that. The COVID response, I've already discussed that basically, but we need a revised master plan initiative to recover from COVID and to position our agriculture going forward. So I just want to, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but the President Ramaphosa has on numerous occasions expanded on the issue of master plans and the importance of master plans. He basically wants inclusive growth, and we cannot argue with that. In fact, that is what we want. We want more people involved in the growth of the sector. And so we've got to create plans that we grow the sector as a whole, but also create far more opportunities in the sector. It must be founded on a partnership between government, labour and industry, and agriculture and agro-processing obviously must be part of that. Why do we want these? We want to ensure that infrastructure, skills, incentives and other resources are directed where we can have the biggest impact for South Africa. So we are engaging with government at various levels, with Delrad and the Minister Didiza, but then also with Minister Patel and DTIC, as well as the Presidency through the PMO on this matter. Then if we look at the template for the master plan framework, this comes from the Presidency. then we'll see that we do a sector profile, a baseline study, and a mapping of the value chain, and that is where BFAP will be helping us together with the NAMC. We'll do a SWOT analysis, high-level indicative priorities that we will identify out of this. I think that Fadi Meyer alluded to certain fault lines that the COVID crisis has clearly shown to us that we need to address in the process. And obviously there will be institutional and governance responsibilities if we sign up to the social compact that we are then busy with. Now agriculture, well, the department has already identified their own master plan, and they are talking to various role players in agriculture on this. And it is based on various economic problems that we have, and I'm not going to go into the detail of that. We have also from the private sector, from Business for South Africa, we have developed our own response plan, essentially a master plan that we are literally in the process of finalizing. It has been consulted widely. So yes, there are differences, and there's going to be a bit of a to and fro to find common ground on how we take agriculture forward. But we are in that process. We have a process that has been delineated. I want to just, in the next few slides, touch on what we, from the private sector side, see as the most important issues. It's a lengthy document and busy slides, but I'm just going to highlight literally the key factors that we want to indicate to you. And in the first one is we need to show that the 4 areas that we want to cover is the context of agriculture, value chain and its contribution to South Africa. In terms of GDP growth, we know that primary agriculture is just over 2% per annum, agro-processing around 4%, and then the retail sector is around 14%, but half of that is food. So you can take, say more or less 7%. That gives you the whole agri-food value chain system probably contributing roughly 13% to total GDP of this country. So very important from business. It provides economic resilience. You heard that I said that while we are going to see a huge GDP knock this year, agriculture will probably be in the positive side. It increases employment. We've seen 20% growth in employment over the last 8 years, from 2012 when the NDP was delivered up to now, also both in agro-processing and primary agriculture. And we've seen an increase in national food security, although we now have a problem with household food security. So we've seen across the whole value chain the output amounts to roughly 1.9 trillion rand. It's a pretty good figure. And primary agriculture accounts for roughly 248 billion and 7% of South Africa's employment, and growing employment at that. We also see that the near-term sectoral impact due to COVID has been less pronounced, although the length of the pandemic, and I alluded to that, is going to be very important, and it's uncertain at this stage. We're probably going to move into a U-shaped recovery, 3 to 5% knock on the whole value chain, although the primary agriculture will be positive. We see for agro-processing it could be negative. We need to look at the longer-term structural issues which are constraining investment and growth. So we need to look at financing, financial liquidity concerns, the infrastructural issues around water, electricity supply and transport infrastructure, and then your regulatory environment, especially around land reform and trade optimization. And plans are already being put into place to address these really structural issues in the agri-food value chain. So addressing these constraints can lead to about 60 to 80,000 jobs per annum being created, an additional 10 to 15 billion rand GDP per annum, both in primary agriculture and in processing. After a number of dry years, South African farmers are financially very vulnerable. We are facing increasing liquidity concerns. We've seen cash flow problems arising because of higher input costs and lower output in the process that we need to address. We've seen that the land bank has come under pressure, primarily because of non-performing loans, and that alludes to the cash flow problems experienced in agriculture generally. The environment hasn't been very positive over the past 2 years, and obviously the pandemic also puts pressure on that. Most of our inputs are bought in dollar terms, so the devaluation of the rand will also have an impact, and we can't get our inputs suddenly substituted, so that opportunity is limited. So the next crops going in will be more expensive putting in. We see climate change as a real factor, and we see especially the Western Cape or the western areas being more negatively impacted. We have to deal with this, and we have to see how we manage our water and our crops more efficiently given climate change. We've done a great study on the product mix and where the state should be supporting and in what ways it should be supporting, especially our high-value crops and our essential goods for the region, especially if we've divided it into macroeconomic, trade opportunity, and national interest. So, for example, from a national interest, maize and poultry score the highest, together with wheat for bread, because these are staples and you're high in protein, your most important source of protein for your poor. But it's perhaps a busy slide, but really a good slide to go through and to see how we must prioritize our spend and our infrastructure development in agriculture. So water infrastructure becomes very important. We've seen far too little investment in water infrastructure. Climate change is going to necessitate that. We also need to make our water use efficiency or increase our water use efficiency right through agriculture, because agriculture will not, the demand for water across industry, households is so high that agriculture will probably not be allocated new water, so that any gains will have to come through water use efficiency. Then we have to look at our sorry, I'm a little bit behind in the slides. Then we have to look at transport infrastructure. This is just on the cash flow, financing the land bank. Then we look at climate change that I alluded to. We look at the product mix, how states should support cultivation of high-value crops and products, essentially. Then we need to look at water infrastructure, spend on water infrastructure. The transport infrastructure is very important, especially road to rail, our ports infrastructure, the issues that have to be done structurally, but also in terms of managerial capacity, efficiency, equipment, etc. We have to look at how we deal with land reform, land redistribution, land restitution, and land tenure rights. Very important. We need to look at the potential to increase efficiency and enhance outcomes for all parties through the 6 targeted interventions that we have identified for land reform. Land reform is a given. We are absolutely against expropriation without compensation, but I believe that expropriation may be a tool that comes in, but we have to warn against the impacts that it will have on land prices, on collateral, etc. In the process. Then we also need to look at the non-commercial farmers, your subsistence farmers, your small-scale farmers, your emerging commercial farmers, how we deal with these sectors. They are part of the economy. They will need support to make them more effective, and a big focus on emerging commercial farmers to ensure that they make a contribution to national food security, to livelihoods, and to use land productively in this process. So inclusive growth is very important, and to also create the mechanisms for them to participate in the economy. So global trade is going to be very important. We need coordinated efforts, and we need to conclude key agreements, especially with countries where we don't have equal access, for example, into China with free trade agreements. Our competitors there all have free trade agreements, like the South American countries, Australasia, etc. So there's a lot of work that has to be done to coordinate between private sector, government, on trade agreements, etc. Then we also need to look at the roadmap for the immediate recovery. I want to stand still on this slide. I think fantastic efforts have been made in our collaboration with government to at least get through the COVID crisis as best possible. We've managed to keep the wheels turning as far as is possible within the measures that have been announced. I think To accelerate through this recovery, we need enhanced capacities and address process inefficiencies, especially around our ports, for example. Future structure of financing, and the land bank is going to be important. We need to begin to legislate the framework for land reform, and we need to re-energize by local campaigns or localization. And then we also have to retool for a new world. We need to look at existing land rights issues for emerging farmers, key infrastructure products, collaborate with private sector development, review revised incentives to further enable private sector involvement, and targeted inclusive growth and interventions, and then conclude on new international trade agreements. So there's a lot of work that we've got to do coming up over the next couple of months. So then just to a take-home message for the last few minutes, and then we can open up for questions. And what I want to share with you is just one slide, is South Africa has a very resilient and a robust agri-food and beverage fibre system. I think surviving the way we did through the Zuma administration is an indication of that, and also through the drought and difficult years that we've had. It's a major asset to this country in terms of national food security. But there are fault lines, and we need to address those fault lines. COVID-19 has exposed those vulnerabilities, especially in certain value chains, especially in infrastructure and logistics, whether it's electricity, whether it's the ports, whether it's the rail system, etc. We can continue water infrastructure too. I think we've seen that the informal market for food system needs to be developed far more and needs to be supported far more, also from an entrepreneurial small business development point of view. And we're already engaging with that, at least with the Gauteng Premier. And we are already, last night I had a call that the Northwest Premier is also looking at something similar. There's great uncertainty around the pandemic and its eventual impact, because we have not seen it play out fully, both locally and globally. So we still have to see what's going to happen. The demand side is going to be the most important thing to manage going forward. You've got to watch the markets, and the markets are changing, and we've got to see how we market our products and to maintain competitiveness and to access those markets. So most important, stay in touch with these developments, with your banks, with your industry organizations, and be prepared to adapt. Be prepared to see what's happening and how you must change. It is going to be business unusual. Exactly how it's going to change, we're not too sure ourselves. Spending patterns will change. How we do business, at least for the next 2 years, will change, and we need to adapt to that. I think if we can leave you with that message, I think you will have learned a lot. So thanks very much again for the opportunity, and I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much, Herman.
Thank you, John. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the questions that are coming through. And I want to start with a question from Gloria Sorobe from Whipple. Gloria, good to have you on the webinar as well. John, Fadi did speak on this, but would like to get your views as well on, just the challenges in getting sustainable food packages to the poorest of communities.
Yeah, morning, Gloria. Glad to hear that you're on the webinar. Gloria, yes. I think when we started to task him, the very first issue that I raised with Minister Didiza was the informal food market, and this is we knew it's going to disrupt it massively. We asked for relaxation on certain of those measures, and the poor were obviously going to be hit the hardest in the process. What we've done from our side is there are two major issues that we've done from agribusiness side. Because firstly, we couldn't take out packages ourselves. It was a lockdown, and the social development department were responsible for that. What we've done in the meantime, we've launched through the agribusiness, or specifically the grain silo owners, a project between all of them and Agbers, and then also major food distributors and aid organizations, to especially developed dry maize meal, let's call it maize meal, or equivalent, to the indigenous communities in the rural areas, where these agribusiness are serving and and operate in. So that is a major project, and that's a project, and I can even put out figures that we are targeting at. We want to try to raise between 50 and 100 million rands worth of maize meal for aid to these indigenous communities in the rural areas. We have already started, and the season has just started. The Grain South Africa are playing a huge role in this. The grain farmers are donating, say, for example, a hectare of maize. The grain silo industry are providing free storage, free handling, free logistics, and the millers are milling for free, just keeping the chop, and then we are making it available to aid organizations. So you can contact them, and we can see, but we want to focus on the rural areas because that is where the need is the biggest at the moment. In the Gauteng area, for the metro areas, etc., we have launched this project through PPGI and then also with the Office of the Premier, where we are making available surplus food, perhaps at concessionary pricing, to townships, informal settlements, to try and get small business development going there. So there are different mechanisms that we are trying to do this. Yes, we need to do more. Food aid alone is not going to turn this around. That's why we want people to get back to work. That's why Business for South Africa asked for at least an alert level 2 as soon as possible, even alert level 1, because we need people to can buy food and get physical and economic access to food. That has been our biggest problem, especially amongst the poor. So it's not a perfect world. The biggest disruption was with the poor, but we are trying our best as far as we can.
John, thank you. And Gloria, just to add from Nedbank's perspective, also a number of initiatives through the Nedbank Foundation, contribution to the Solidarity Fund to assist with alleviating I really see it as a humanitarian challenge to get food to the poorest. What we've also done in the Agric network that Nedbank has through AgBiz and also engagement with AgriSA is one of our clients that we're very proud to bank, Food Forward SA, that has a very effective network to get well-packaged food parcels, nutritional food parcels through to the poorest of the communities, to connecting them with the farming community to contribute to the food security. I'd like to move to, John, you mentioned on the concerns around liquidity. And this was actually a question from Elton Grief, EMG Agri Solutions. First off, on the land bank, but before you get to the land bank, Elton's question was also on what the banks are doing. And Elton, if I can answer from Nedbank's perspective. So, as mentioned earlier, even before lockdown, Nedbank Business Banking and Nedbank as a whole reached out to our client base in Nedbank Business Banking, to all our clients, to be proactive, to determine if they foresee any challenges from a cash flow perspective, from a liquidity perspective, and to assist them. We assisted quite a large community of our client base, but then also the government-backed loan scheme that was announced on the 21st of April by President Ramaphosa. Nedbank is a proud participant in that. We were very quick out the starting blocks to be ready and operational, and there are a number of requests coming through from the market to assist clients. Obviously, the government-backed scheme is where an entity really exhausted all capacity to borrow. Then they would qualify for that. But through our proactive position that we took in the market, we were able to already assist quite a number of our clients. But I think more importantly, if we look at the land bank and the systemic impact that the land bank can have on liquidity specific to agri sector, John, can just get your view on what's recommended there.
Yes. Herman, a very good question, and Elton, good to see you also on the webinar. Worked very closely with you over many years. Yes, we are concerned about the liquidity crunch in general and specifically also in the land bank. We've seen the pronouncements made by the DG of National Treasury in Parliament on the land bank issue, where National Treasury have committed to assist the land bank to keep it operational. It will come with certain restructuring, but at least I think the because of the big exposure of agriculture to the land bank, we need to keep it going from an agribusiness point of view and from a farmer point of view. So I think it will probably be business as usual, at least for the short term, but in the longer term, there are going to be changes for sure in terms of the mandate and also the role that the commercial banks play and vis-a-vis the land bank, etc. But that we'll try to manage so that we don't have disruption in finance in the process. Obviously, finance is very important to agriculture. We've worked very hard from Agbi's side around the blended finance, obviously with BASA and with you on this. I think that's the way to go. We will need support in terms of softening up loans to get the right investment into the agri-food system. We desperately need that. I think the urgency that we see now with COVID is just accelerating the implementation of the blended finance. It's one of the Job Summit outcomes. So I think Theo Bosse from our side has been driving that extensively with many of the banks, and so that's the right way to go, and hopefully we can get that moving now.
Thank you, John. And maybe just to close that point also, Elton, if we look at the commercial banks in South Africa, well capitalized and ready to address and assist the South African economy. If I can go to Siyanda Sishuba, it's good to have the press also from Farmers Weekly on the webinar. Siyanda's question is, what was the projection of GDP growth before COVID, specifically to the agri sector, and now after the COVID impact, John?
Yeah, my chief economist, Wandile Sihlobo, and I had quite a lot of discussions around this in December, when we could see how things were developing December, January, before pre-COVID. And we were expecting at least a 10% year-on-year growth in agriculture because of the better rains and better forecasts of crops and etc. Because we already had an indication of that. And I think with post-COVID, I think if we get there are more risks now. Let's put it that way, because of the distribution, the sales that are down, and then also prices might come down, and we still don't know what the disruption is going to be in the ports finally. Tomorrow is a very important meeting with the minister on this. So if we can manage all the potential risks, and we can still at least get 10% year-on-year growth in primary agriculture. We probably expect a drop in agro-processing, definitely between 3 and 5%. And then down the whole value chain, there will obviously also be in total a drop in the process.
Let's talk about the ports. There was a question also on the ports capacity and what can be done to, just address the bottlenecks in the ports. And we all know the critical role that it plays to the export earnings.
Yes, I think it's a question I raised at a meeting with Minister Gordon on Friday that BLSA and BUSA had on the whole DPE portfolio, Eskom, etc. But we raised the issue on the ports because it really has shown up as to be a critical, an absolute critical node in our economy, not just for agriculture, but very specifically also for agriculture. And he invited us to a meeting, and that's why we have the meeting tomorrow. The issue in the ports is complex. Durban was definitely not operating at close to capacity or pre-COVID. Cape Town was pretty okay. What happened in Cape Town, there were 5-6 cases of COVID. The workforce weren't feeling safe. They don't come to work. You slash your time that you have, your gangs. We didn't have straddle cranes. We had to import straddle cranes so that we could also, because wind is a very big factor. The port closes down when the wind gets too strong there. So the equipment was also not right. There was also not PPE, personal protection equipment for the workers. And they wanted to be tested, etc. So one can understand those. These are the dynamics that we have to work through. What happens if the shipping lines have to wait 12, 13 days before they can access the harbour? They go past. They sail past. And then we can't load. And then we have wastage of perishable products like fresh fruit, etc. So it's those waiting times and getting the ships through and getting the cargo through, which is the big problem. So your port's efficiency is incredibly important. Our ports generally are substandard in terms of moves per crane, which is a global efficiency indicator. And we need to get that right. We need to have the right equipment. We need to have the right infrastructure. Durban needs to be deepened. But some of these are long-term, but they're also short-term issues that we need to address. So it's a labour issue, it's an equipment issue, it's a managerial issue, it's an access issue into the ports. There are a number of factors that we need to address. It's quite complex, but these are the issues that we'll be putting on the table for the Minister tomorrow.
And obviously, as you say, John, a very important role that ACBIS is playing in that, and tomorrow's meeting with the Minister is going to be critical.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Kobus Low from SAPEX asked this question, so just acknowledging Kobus. Thank you, Kobus, for that question. John, if I look at Vaughan Koopman's question from Danone, there was also another question, just some views on the dairy industry. And just Vaughan's question reads as follows: any insight on the impact of COVID on the dairy farmer?
Yes, that's some limited discussion on the dairy industry with Chris van Dijk and so on. We've also engaged the dairy industry in this project with the Office of the Premier of Gauteng, because it's a perishable product. We've seen in the dairy in the dairy industry, especially in the processing part of it, that sales are down. Because often that goes into your restaurants, your cheeses, etc., into your QSRs and restaurants, etc. So sales are down on dairy products. We are very much aware of that, and that's why we're also trying to see how we can stimulate demand in those industries. So there has been an impact. It's more on the demand side again. So we've got to manage the demand side of this better, and we're trying to focus as much as possible on the demand side, trying where the distribution networks have been cut off, whether it's upmarket restaurants or QSRs or hot meals in retail, but then also even into the informal sector. We've got to get the distribution networks working properly again. And obviously there's risk of spread. That's why they were cut off. But we've got to manage the access to food also with the risk of infection that we have. So managing that and maintaining a health and safe environment, but making those distribution networks working and getting the markets to work is absolutely critical, also for the dairy industry.
Switching to the wool industry, any outlook on the wool price and what this impact will be?
Yes, we have good contacts with our wool members, and then also specifically with Cape Wools, and prices were a bit down, and I think it's demand has been a little bit slack. But I think I understand that it will start picking up again. I think we must understand the disruption globally, and most of our wool goes to China. It's going to take time for the whole Chinese factory, if I can call it that, because it's to a certain degree the world's factory, is to get that demand fully up and running. So I think there is still a little bit slack of demand, but I think as we get post-recovery, and we get normalization of markets and distribution, it will pick up again.
Thank you. And Gawie Kutsia from FMG Bundamar, thank you for that question. John, this question is from Andrew Robinson from Northwest University. It's quite a mouthful. I'm going to read it. Epidemiologists warned for many years of pandemic emerging industrialized animal production breaking out in that. And data has linked non-communicable diseases to animal protein. So in the interest of preventing pandemics going forward, how will this play out in the agri industry post-COVID?
Yes, look, nothing in life is risk-free. We must understand that. And I think to go without any animal products would also not work. So how we manage disease and risk going forward, I think, is going to be very, very important. It's not necessarily industrial areas that have caused this problem. By all accounts and the best verifiable scientific information we have, it started in so-called wet markets in China. I've been to China a couple of times, and I've seen now those wet markets work. They're not hygienic. It's terrible, in fact. And so we actually need a more regulated system where we can manage these things better. I can take African swine flu fever, for example, in the pork industry. When you have those type of situations, it's much better to have a concentrated, well harmonized, sanitized, safe environment for production than what you have free-roaming pigs, if I can call it that, all over the place. The spread is enormous. You can't stop you can't quarantine the spread. You can't isolate. So managing, and when you have these type of diseases, whether it's in animals or in humans, you've got to quarantine. You've got to isolate. So it's very important that we have those type of processes. I can't see us not stopping industrial production. It's managing the safety and the sanitization, everything around those production areas, both from an animal production point of view, even from a human safety point of view in the process.
John, I have two questions regarding the textile industry as the offtake from agri-produce. The first one is from Marco Kutsia, so I'm first going to handle that and then we'll go to the next one. Marco Kutsia from Moer, South Africa. Question is, how long do you predict will it take to get back to pre-COVID economic conditions for natural fibers? He makes the comment that 80%, roughly 80% of mohair gets exported to China and Italy, and the demand seems to slowly recover.
Yes, I think I alluded to that with the wool. Is that the demand is recovering. It's slow. I think it's really a question of demand. What is the end consumer prepared to spend on textiles, on clothing, etc.? So we actually had an offline informal discussion exactly on that in sales. So it's when confidence comes back to the consumer, the demand will necessarily feed back down the value chain. Yeah. So I think we must just give it a bit of time. And I'm actually quite positive that it's going to come back a little bit sooner than what we expected. We're already seeing more economic activity picking up. And the consumer will start getting out again when he starts feeling more confident to get out. So it's going to depend on how the disease develops. It's going to depend on when we reach a peak in South Africa, but also when the global peak is reached. Because we've seen the epicenter move from China to Europe, to North America, now to Latin America. It might still come to Africa. We don't know. Yeah. And not even the epidemiologists know. So that's why it's such an uncertain environment. That's why we've got to watch the markets and understand how they're going to develop. It's going to take a bit of time. We've got to, so be careful, take small steps. It's not the time for big steps at the moment. Take small steps, consolidate, make sure that you understand the markets and adapt to those new markets.
And then from Tian Potgieter, Loskop Cotton, specifically on cotton, but with the view of import restrictions from other sovereignties, what's the outlook on cotton? Is there, maybe expectation that retail stores will partake in bigger takeoff?
Yeah, it's very much the same question. It comes back to the consumer and what the consumer is going to do in the process and what the consumer is going to spend. And we've seen the consumer really sit tight. The consumer has sat at home and he's spending on food and the absolute basic necessities. He's not really spending on clothes, on TVs, on cars and on all the other things that you would spend. So it will take a bit of time for that, and that will only come back gradually as the shops open and as people feel more confident to move out and to start spending there, and as they get jobs and employment increases as well. So we must understand that this is a huge economic disruption. Exactly how it's going to pan out. They said the Great Depression of the 1930s was actually a 10-year impact. And we do not know how long this is going to impact. What support measures we're going to need from government, because we're also going to sit with a lot of debt, but we do need the stimulus packages that we alluded to to get the economy back. But it's going to take time. What we must do now is, while pressing the reset button, is to be more have more responsible capitalism, if I can call it that, is to take more people with us in the process. We need to look at the inclusiveness of the value chains, etc., and create more opportunity, because we also run the risk in this COVID pandemic that we have greater inequality developing. Those that have the means to survive and those that are really more destitute now. So we've got to get the balance right in getting the economy going and getting demand going in the process. It will take time. Don't be over hasty, but take small steps, and watch the markets. Speak to your market agents, speak to the banks, etc., that are monitoring the markets all the time.
John, last question. Speaking of economic disruption, Willie Clark from RPO has a question that there is a view that COVID will lead to de-urbanization. What's your view on that in terms of South Africa, and how does that impact value chains in the agri sector?
Yes, it may. I think definitely globalization. Let's first start with the globalization issue. Is going to be disrupted, and I think we're going to see greater localization. We were actually seeing it before COVID. COVID has just exacerbated that. President Trump his policy was localization. We've seen it with the motor industry, etc. Whether we're going to see less urbanization and more ruralization, I'm not too sure at this stage. I think we're still going to see. Perhaps it will slow down, but we're still going to see a move to urbanization and not to rural. The rural communities are the poorest communities, and that's why we have a focus on the rural communities. It's really not looking good in rural South Africa. I personally think government has underspent totally on the rural communities, and rural development has actually been a failure. In too many. You and I come from the same small town in the Free State originally, yes. and we've seen that the absolute devastation in the rural towns, yeah. and the poverty there, and we really need to have a greater rural investment. Then you will get more people moving into those areas if you're creating the right agro-processing, the right investments in those areas. But it's not going to happen before there are not jobs there.
John, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your inputs. We really appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Herman. Great pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our webinar. As mentioned, this webinar is recorded, so the content, the recording, as well as all the questions and relevant answers, even those we didn't get to, will be circulated to yourselves. So there were a number of questions on asking the content of the presentations, and that will be circulated definitely. We thank you for your time. So just in a wrap-up, no doubt the agri sector is key for the recovery of the economy in South Africa and the upliftment of our society. And Nedbank sees this sector as a key strategic sector for sustainable growth of the economy, whilst creating jobs, providing food security, preserving the environment and uplifting society. And our products and our advice and our solutions are tailored to this strategic view that we take on the agri sector. It's aligned to the view that we take on the agri sector. If you are a client, if you're not a client of Nedbank, in either cases, do speak to us. Speak to your banker. We have solutions that we can partner with you to invest in this very important sector that can grow our society and uplift every South African. Thank you very much. Do stay safe, and goodbye.